Sir Winston Churchill was a meticulous planner. In fact, he even planned his own funeral down to the last detail. He chose the hymns that would be sung and the scriptures that would be read. Then, as the service ended and his coffin was being carried through St. Paul's Cathedral, a trumpeter was to play taps, that hauntingly mournful dirge which signals the end of another day. But then, as the last notes of taps died away, another trumpeter was to play reveille, that very different signal announcing the dawning of a new day. And that could well serve as a description of Holy Week. Good Friday may have ended with a mournful dirge, but Easter morning was wakened to a very different sound. He is not here. He has risen from the dead. And this was to become the central message that was proclaimed by the early church, so central, in fact, that the Apostle Paul felt compelled to write in that letter to the Philippians, "For the sake of Jesus Christ, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, that I might know Christ and the power of his resurrection." Well, does every one of us here today have that same intimate knowledge of Easter morning's news? Not just the kind of second-hand knowledge you get from reading a book or hearing a sermon. No, I mean the kind of knowledge that is more intimate, more personal. Now, of course, there will be those here this morning who can say with confidence that they do, and we honor them. But there may be some of us who have to whisper in the secrecy of our hearts, "I don't really know, and how can I be absolutely certain?" So let me suggest two questions that we can ask ourselves as a way of discovering if we really are a people who've come to know the power of Easter's message. And the first question is, as we look around us, do we see our world as though it had been gripped by a resurrection? There have always been at least two ways of looking at life. One is to see it through the eyes of a pessimist. H.G. Wells once said that man who began in a cave behind a windbreak will end up in the disease-soaked ruins of a slum. And while that's one way to look at life, it's not the only way. Take, for example, the Gospels story. It's about a man who was arrested and tried on trumped-up charges and then savagely beaten and brought to death on a cross by a bunch of brutal louts. It's the kind of story that's grist for the mill for any pessimist. Is it any wonder then that as those first disciples gathered in Jerusalem on the day after the crucifixion, is it any wonder that the world must have seemed to them like a cruel and heartless place? Its military ruthlessness had taken all their dreams and nailed them to a Roman gibbet. Its religious corruption had so successfully seduced Judas Iscariot that he had betrayed his master to the temple authorities for a mere pittance. Its easygoing attitude towards lying had driven Simon Peter to deny any knowledge of the Galilean, and its shameful lack of courage had caused nearly all the disciples to abandon their Lord and Master in his hour of greatest need. Everywhere those followers of Christ had looked, they could see nothing but death and despair, political corruption and religious hypocrisy. But even more than that, there was their own sense of terrible shame because of the part they had played in the drama of Good Friday. But 24 hours later, the news of an empty tomb had broken into their lives and had changed everything around them beyond recognition. If Christ had risen from the dead, then it meant that the powers of evil didn't have the last word after all. It meant that they were living in a world which belonged to God, and that every human experience and every human situation had been touched and transformed by the power of Easter's victory. It meant that since God had defeated death, that he had the power to conquer all the deadness that infected their world and crippled its sorry life. Well, is that how we're looking at our world this morning? Oh, I know it's easy to dwell on all its signs of evil and its failure, on the carnage of its wars, the shamelessness of its slums, the devil-ridden effects of its prejudices in all its forms, and the blatant grasping at power in its political world, and, I'm sad to say, in its religious world as well. Yet isn't that precisely what those first disciples must have seen on that first Good Friday? There was the injustice that had been meted out during the trial of Jesus before Caiaphas the high priest and Pontius Pilate the Roman governor, followed by the barbarity of a crucifixion. But then, after all the dismal events of that dreadful day, there had come those words of hope and promise: he is not here. He has risen from the dead. Well, how are we looking at the world around us? Are we merely caught up in what seems like a dull and deadening existence, never expecting any more from it than a negative response, or do we reach out to embrace its life, confident that everything about it has indeed been touched and transformed by the glorious news of Easter morning? But the second question we need to ask ourselves is, have we experienced the power of this glorious resurrection in our own individual lives? Because the fact is that some of us may still be living with a religion that merely drags us along from week to week, as if the story of Easter had never been written. Or worse still, it may have turned its good news into a weapon that we can use to judge and condemn those with whom we disagree, rather than embracing it as a message which is proclaiming the possibility of hope and healing, of reconciliation and love. In other words, are we still living on the wrong side of Easter Day? But look again at what happened to those first disciples. They had watched the forces of evil drive their Lord and Master to a grim and painful death. Except that's not where the story ends. Because the incredible news that gripped Jerusalem was that Christ had escaped the deadly clutches of the grave. And ever since, the news of Easter has come scampering down through the centuries, hollering, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. It's what we sing about in our hymns. It's what we read about in our Bibles. It's the incredible assertion we repeat in our creeds. Jesus Christ, we say, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. And on the third day, he rose again from the dead. And it's why the Apostle Paul felt compelled to cry out with triumphant confidence, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? But, and this is the only question that really matters, do we honestly believe that Easter's message does indeed have the power to change the world and transform our individual lives? There's a legend which tells how the wife of Pontius Pilate sent for the centurion who had been in charge of the crucifixion and asked him if he had any idea where the body of Jesus had been taken. I don't know where he is, replied the centurion. All I do know is that a power has been let loose upon the world, and there is no force on earth that can ever stop it. It's only a legend. Nonetheless, its message rings true. For indeed a power has been let loose upon this world of ours, and the gospel invites all of us to share in its promise of new life. However, we'll never really know the truth of Easter's glad tidings by reading about it in a book or hearing it in a sermon. It will only become a living reality when we embrace it as a force that's already at work in each and every one of our lives. For it's then that we'll begin to see the world around us being transformed, since it's then we'll have met with a risen Christ who has triumphed over everything that is dark and deadly in this life. And it's then we'll see its glorious promise of newness being let loose in you and me, a promise that no force on earth can ever hope to contain. And the very essence of this blazing, strange message is caught and held in those memorable words that come echoing down to us from that very first Easter morning. He is not here. He has risen from the dead. Amen. And thanks be to God.